Hi everyone. More about standards. So it's a fun afternoon. I'm Valentina Marincioni from UCL, but I'm also working in the UK Centre for Moisture in Buildings, where we try to improve the quality of buildings from a moisture point of view. And that's why I'm highly involved in the retrofit of historic buildings and traditional buildings in general. This presentation was prepared by Peter Rickaby, who is the technical author of the PAS 2035, which is an overarching standard that is now published in the UK, was published just a few months ago, with the aim of improving the retrofit quality across the board. So the idea is that, okay, there have been a lot of, there has been evidence on issues associated with the retrofit of traditional buildings, or in general, the retrofit of existing buildings. And in particular, the ones that are not listed, because there are 25% of the buildings in the UK are pre-1919, so they need to be retrofitted, and in many cases we found defects in the retrofit. So the idea with these standards is to have an overarching standard that brings in all the other international standards and is an umbrella for improving the retrofit of buildings. And for example, the standard that you've seen before is one of the standards recommended, it's a mandatory standard for the achievement of the quality that is in this standard. So in a way, they are linked. So the standard is a retrofit code of practice. So it's a technical standard that has to be used in particular for a publicly funded retrofit. So there is there's Trustmark in the UK, which is it's a way of providing quality assurance on retrofit, and it's mandatory for publicly funded retrofit. And the Trustmark has to be done according to this code of practice for retrofit. And the idea of this standard is to fit within a bigger set of technical standards that include guidance and training, and that consider the retrofit process and the quality assurance. So the code of practice tries to present a framework for the training, retrofit process, and quality assurance that can improve the quality of buildings in the UK. So in the UK, they set up the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group, of which Peter Rickaby is the head. And the objective was to improve the functionality and durability of buildings, energy efficiency, comfort, but also to protect and enhance architectural heritage. So having a standard that could consider both non-protected building, protected building, but also traditional buildings which don't fit within the criteria for protected buildings would allow to improve the quality across the board and minimize the performance gap. The principles are focus on materials, workmanship, and processes, and make retrofit standards accessible, which is something we also discussed about in terms of tools and guidelines, and also combine technical standards with guidance, and which is the effort that in the IEA Task 59 we care about. So the framework is the code of practice which sits in here. And what is happening at the moment, there are some existing standards which are all referred to in this PAS 2035, but also the British standard is going to issue new standards associated to the retrofit of existing buildings. And also there is a collection of standards which are not associated with the British standard institutions, but they are developed by other organizations within the UK. So some key points of the standard is that the application is to any domestic retrofit project, not just the projects which are associated with an obligation by the government, which are these eco projects, energy company obligations. And also must be required in conjunction with other standards. The PAS 2030 is a standard about installation, so it's a standard that regulates the installation process and is associated with this standard. And also requires the use of many other framework standards, as I mentioned before. And one key point is that there is a role, the role of Retrofit Coordinator, which is responsible to ensure that the standards is used appropriately. So PAS 2035 is considered, and protecting the client's interest and the public interest. So this is in general the overview of the standard, which I'm going to look at in detail. I think the first thing is about the project inception. And what has changed from the past is that there are established intended outcomes together with the client. So rather than having a top-down approach, as Alexandra was saying in the previous presentation, rather than providing targets, we are actually starting with a conversation with the client where some intended outcomes are set. So some intended outcomes might include the energy use, so the intended energy use of the building, or the reduction in emissions. Others might be associated with the indoor environmental quality of the building, including the elimination of damp and mold. Others might be meeting a performance standard or a voluntary standard. Others could be about protecting the building against decay or deterioration. But more important for us is the protection or enhancement of architectural heritage. So these are intended outcomes that must be agreed at the start. And based on that, everything will be assessed against. So rather than assessing against a target coming from top, it's assessed against intended outcomes. And also the improving the usefulness of sustainability of the building. So there could be various intended outcomes. So one element here is the first risk assessment, which is an element that is required to understand the level of expertise required in the process. So there are three paths, A, B, and C. A is the simple path. B is probably would be for most retrofit cases, and C is for special cases such as buildings of heritage interest. So this risk assessment is carried out by the Retrofit Coordinator, and it's based on a pre-assessment before whole dwelling assessment. So there are 5 criteria, which I'm going to show. And these 3 paths, which I already mentioned. Simple requirement, more onerous, and much more onerous for path C. So in terms of the criteria, so first is the number of dwellings to be improved. If it's a building, one-off is not very critical. If it's more than 30 buildings, like stock level, would be higher risk, so higher criteria. And then the average number of measures per dwelling. If it's one measure, we will go for a low risk. More than one measure will increase. Then there is a table on inherent technical risk of the highest risk measure, which I'm going to show you later. There is an information on the risk associated to the combination of measures. So some measures, as we know, the combination of some measures will lead to unintended consequences, and that was done within the industry. There has been a debate looking at the inherent risk of measures and the risk associated with the interaction of measures. And also the construction of built form of buildings, which includes, for example, traditional non-protected buildings. They would fall within risk grade B, and protected and any construction. So protected, which means listed conservation areas or areas in World Heritage centers, are in higher risk C. The overall grade is based on whether if you have any C's here, you will have an overall grade of C. If you have any B's, you will have B. If you have no C's or B's, you will have A. So it's a bit more extreme scenario. So going quickly in the inherent technical risks, this was the result of the agreement within the board of the steering group in the PAS 2035. And so there is a higher risk for internal solid wall insulation and lower risk, for example, for, I don't know, heat recovery ventilators in a room. And then this is a measures interaction matrix where there is a quick look at what measures can be done, can be put together, and what measures should not be installed together in the same building. So the red one is, this is measures that cannot be installed together in the same building. And the green one, measures that don't interact. Yellow are measures that may connect, so there may be connections between, for example, the wall and the floor. And the other one is interactions between different types of measures, like the systems and the wall. So in a way, it's a quick way to identify whether there is an extra level of analysis needed. So the dwelling assessment, which comes, so now we know path A, B, or C, so we know how stringent we need to be in the assessment. And then if we are working with traditional protected buildings, during the dwelling assessment, there is a need for significance assessment, and that's based on another British standard, which is 7913 on the conservation of historic buildings. So there is, within the overall framework, there is a big, it's important to notice that when you have traditional buildings and protected buildings, so not just buildings in Class C, but also buildings in Class B, you would have to have a significance assessment according to the standard. In PAS 2035 is for the buildings that are traditional but not protected, which are for an energy efficiency of traditional buildings, that could be the tricky ones because they are free to do whatever they want, but they might hinder the heritage value of a building if it's not protected. So for those buildings in Path B, they are developing tools for a significance assessment which is based on the standard, but is not as demanding as an assessment for historic buildings. So in a way, the STBA, which is looking at the tools, is trying to provide tools for everyone to improve the buildings in a meaningful way. And these are things that the whole dwelling assessment must include, and I'm going to go through just a few of them. Is the appraisal of the dwelling's heritage, architectural features, structure and construction, and conditions, and also the appraisal of the conditions and building services. Constraints imposed by the site. I'm going a bit further. Identification of any energy efficiency measure already installed and proposed, because in traditional buildings, you might find that in the 70s, as we've seen before, or in the past, there had been measures installed, which we need to consider when the new plan is done. And an appraisal of the construction to establish the thermal properties of the building, so to evaluate how the whole house retrofit can be done in a meaningful way, identification of building services, and an estimate of an annual fuel use. So if we go on the evaluation and medium-term plan and the design stage after the whole house assessment. So the design has to provide the outcomes agreed for with the client. So again, we go back to the intended outcomes, and that's what the design has to provide. And it has to be based on a whole dwelling assessment that was done before, which is something that is not, so far in the UK, wasn't done in a systematic way. It has to take into account the architectural and heritage context, planning and building control requirements, allow for management of moisture in buildings. This is what I normally do. Include construction details, because often the design is based on one-dimensional analysis of buildings, so stick insulation on wall and runway. This is changing at the moment. Considering interfaces, interaction, connective effects, these are all elements that are now in the PAS. Include a ventilation upgrade, and so on. Something that I want to say now is that all this information has to be stored in the data warehouse that is going to be the repository for the information for any quality assurance procedure. So when the project is evaluated, all the information, these information that are supporting design will be stored there. Just looking at the paths, the different path B and C, something interesting that is required in B and C is a medium-term retrofit plan, which is also called a passport, so a building passport. And that's something that is being discussed in the UK at the moment, so that the improvements of the dwelling from now until 2050 will be recorded and planned. And also Path C, which is about protected building, requires specialist expertise when these are to be improved. I'm not going into detail with this. This is PAS 2030 about the installation. So to comply with PAS 2035, the installer have to comply to this standard, which is for them in particular. Finally, monitoring and evaluation, which is an important element for quality assurance. Again, we go back to the intended outcome. So all the standard is done to make sure that the intended outcomes are fulfilled, and also identifying any unintended consequences. So what is proposed in the standard is to apply basic monitoring, so post-occupancy evaluation monitoring questionnaire to the clients to see whether these outcomes are actually met or not. If not, there is a need for further investigation, so more intermediate monitoring, so to investigate poor outcomes, unintended consequences. If these consequences if that's not enough, there is further investigation required to understand and resolve discrepancies between the predicted and actual outcomes. And finally, there is an element on what's required to be a coordinator, advisor, assessor, design evaluator. So looking at the roles within the project. And so there is this introduction of a retrofit coordinator, which is a new role, which could also be done by the designer. And also the introduction of a retrofit evaluator who would evaluate on the project, which is independent, of course, from the other roles. So in summary, there is a first risk assessment to determine how strict to be and how the level of documentation as well that would go in the data warehouse, and the required qualification. So the required qualification will depend on the assessed risk. In terms of design, again, the requirements will depend on the risk, and there is this introduction of a medium-term plan, and also it's clear that additional requirements must be in place for traditionally constructed buildings. Ventilation needs to be assessed, upgraded or inadequate. I haven't touched upon ventilation, but there is a big element on ventilation as well in this PAS. And also, this is an introduction. The introduction of measures interaction matrix is a fairly recent development that is used in risk assessment. So this is the idea to go from an elemental analysis to a wider analysis that considers interaction. And finally, we need to make sure the monitoring evaluation are done properly to investigate discrepancy. And this was all done to drive better quality in retrofit across the whole board. Next step, so the PAS 2035 was issued in June, published in June, so now it's becoming mandatory for publicly funded projects. So from January 2021, probably it's going to slip for a bit, but these energy company obligations, which are these obligations that big energy companies have to pay, they're going to be connected to Trustmark and PAS 2035. And also, they are promoting Trustmark in the UK, which is this requirement for publicly funded buildings, and it's associated with PAS 2035. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.